Where did Jesus come from if he existed, and was it made up? As an atheist, I reject any notion of Jesus being a divine figure or possessing supernatural powers. However, I align myself with the views of mainstream scholarship that acknowledge Jesus as a historical figure. I strongly disagree with the Mythicist perspective, which posits that Jesus may not have existed at all. While I dismiss the supernatural claims surrounding Jesus, I believe it's essential to address the question of his historicity. In this series, I will present my arguments for why I believe Jesus was a real person who lived in the first century, despite the various myths and legends that have grown around him over time. The Book of Luke, a New Testament account of the life of Jesus, tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but grew up in a town called Nazareth during the reign of Cyrenius, the Syrian governor, amidst a Roman-wide taxation. Luke 2:1-4. But can we trust this information, given that the Gospel of Luke was written about 60 years after Jesus' death by an author who never personally knew him? More importantly, can we believe in the existence of a place like Nazareth during Jesus' time? Some supporters of mythicism claim that Nazareth never existed and that the whole concept of Jesus being from there is fabricated. Is this claim valid, or is there evidence to support that Nazareth was a real location and Jesus really came from there? Let's examine this claim thoroughly and see if the mythicist position holds ground. One of the most vocal proponents of the claim that Nazareth never existed at the time of Jesus is René Salm, who presents his argument in his book, The Myth of Nazareth. According to Salm, Nazareth didn't exist as a settlement during the time of Jesus, and any modern archaeological site believed to be Nazareth is a misidentification. He even claims that the village of Nazareth was re-inhabited after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and does not appear to have had any presence during the time of Jesus. His main argument is the supposed lack of archaeological evidence for a Nazareth during the 1st century CE. In his book, Salm writes, "For I have never dated anything at all. I have simply identified the relevant archaeological experts and quoted their published datings. Hans-Peter Kuhnen on Kokim tombs, Varda Sussman on bow-spouted oil lamps, Roland Dines on Jewish stone vessels, Amos Kloner on circular blocking stones, and so on. The case regarding Nazareth does not rest on my opinion at all. Anyone who disagrees with the myth of Nazareth is not disagreeing with me, but is taking issue with the leading archaeological experts in the world." The Myth of Nazareth, page 1. But here lies the first problem. Sam's claims lack scientific credentials. He has no formal training in archaeology or any related field. He cherry-picks studies from other scholars to support his theory, but these experts do not necessarily agree with him. His analysis, which ignores contradicting evidence, is built on a flawed interpretation of archaeological findings. One of the strongest pieces of evidence against Salm's claims comes from the discovery of Koch tombs in the area. Koch tombs are burial sites that are carved into rock and were historically associated with wealthy Jewish families in Judea. These tombs are indicative of 1st century Jewish life in the region. Salm argues that the tombs found in the area are not from the 1st century but from earlier periods, perhaps dating to the 2nd century or after the 70 CE destruction. Archaeologists such as Ever Bellarmino Bagatti and others have documented burial sites near Nazareth. Bagatti, in particular, excavated tombs that he believed dated to the 1st century CE, but Salm has challenged his conclusions, arguing that the evidence actually suggests later dates. However, as Professor Bart Ehrman points out, the issue with Salm's argument is that he fails to recognize that Koch tombs were expensive to build, meaning that only wealthy families could afford them. There's no record suggesting Nazareth had wealthy families during the time of Jesus. As Ehrman puts it, moreover, Salm fails to stress one of the most important points about these special kinds of rock-cut tombs. They were expensive to make, and only the wealthiest families could afford them. There is nothing in any of our records to suggest that Nazareth had wealthy families in the days of Jesus. And so the fact that no Koch tombs from the time of Jesus were found in Nazareth indicates precisely nothing about its existence. In fact, the Koch tombs found in the area lend credence to the notion that Nazareth existed as a modest Jewish village during the time of Jesus, and those using this tomb type were wealthy enough to live there. It's not an issue of Nazareth not existing, it's about understanding the context of its settlement and population. Beyond tombs, there is other evidence that corroborates the existence of Nazareth. Archaeologists have discovered coins from the 1st century CE in the region, specifically during the time when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, as mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. Cyrenius, a historical figure whose role is well documented by Jewish Roman historian Josephus, oversaw the census that Luke refers to in his Gospel. Josephus writes in Antiquities of the Jews, Book the 7, Chapter 1, Cyrenius came himself into Judea, which was now added to the province of Syria, to take an account of their substance. Moreover, archaeologist Yedena Alexandre, who was responsible for excavations in the Nazareth area, found coins dating to the 1st century CE, along with pottery from the time. These coins and artifacts support the claim that Nazareth was a significant site during the time of Jesus. Mythicists have tried to dismiss these findings by pointing out that certain archaeological reports from the Israel Antiquities Authority (IAA) have been removed from their website, supposedly to deny the dating of the findings. However, a careful look at the IAA's website shows that the articles still remain accessible, and the IAA's findings, including pottery from the 1st century, align with the archaeological evidence that supports the existence of Nazareth during the time of Jesus. Another critical argument mythicists make is that the lack of Nazareth's mention in the Old Testament proves it did not exist. This claim is weak at best, and to argue that a location's existence hinges on its mention in the Jewish scriptures is flawed logic. The geography of the Bible is far from straightforward, and many locations were not mentioned in the Bible yet still existed. As stated in the Lands of the Bible, a thematic guide, as ruling empires changed, so did place names and geographical boundaries. As a result, places in the Bible often have numerous names or variant language and spellings. Just because a place is not explicitly named in the Old Testament does not mean it didn't exist. There is plenty of evidence from other archaeological digs in the region that support the existence of numerous towns that were not mentioned in the Jewish scriptures. Furthermore, place names evolve over time. The site being excavated today could easily be the ancient Nazareth, and the absence of its mention in the Old Testament only makes it more likely that Nazareth was a small, rural settlement. Just because it wasn't on the radar of biblical scholars or mentioned in the Old Testament does not mean it was non-existent. Mythicists also claim that Nazareth wasn't inhabited during Jesus' time and was instead occupied only after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. However, this theory doesn't hold up for several reasons. First, settlements do not simply pick up and leave and then re-inhabit a location later without any explanation for the shift. Second, the argument that the site was abandoned during Jesus' time contradicts the established evidence of occupation throughout the 1st century. Why would people leave the area during the time of Jesus and then suddenly return afterward? It makes no sense, especially since this area was not a site for Roman garrisons as mythicists claim. The theory falls apart when we consider the archaeological evidence. Further supporting evidence for Nazareth's existence comes from a 2002 to 2003 excavation under a shop in modern-day Nazareth, where a Roman bathhouse dating to the 1st century CE was discovered. The bathhouse is laid out in an early Roman style, with features like underfloor heating and a cold room, which were typical of that time period. Professor Maurice Greenberg, a well-respected expert in Judaic studies, confirmed the significance of this discovery. I am sure that what we have here is a bathhouse from the time of Jesus, and the consequences of that for archaeology and for our knowledge of the life of Jesus are enormous. Not only does this bathhouse serve as tangible evidence for the existence of a Roman settlement in the region, but it also supports the idea that the town of Nazareth was a legitimate settlement during Jesus' time. John Oakes, a Christian apologist and scholar, has also argued that the archaeological evidence for Nazareth's existence is overwhelming. He writes, "There is plenty more evidence, both historical and archaeological, that Nazareth was indeed occupied at the time of Jesus' birth." At this point, it is reasonable to say that we can put to rest the claim that there is no evidence Nazareth was occupied in the 2nd century. It is simply not true. Oakes points out that even if there were no physical evidence for Nazareth in the 1st century, which is no longer the case, the mere fact that Jesus and his followers were known as Nazarenes already implies the existence of the village. No one would be called a Nazarene if such a place didn't exist. The idea that Jesus and his followers could have been known as Nazarenes without there being an actual village of Nazareth seems absurd. As Oakes and others have argued, the only logical explanation is that Nazareth was a real place, and Jesus was truly from there. In conclusion, the mythicist claim that Nazareth did not exist during the time of Jesus falls apart when we examine the historical, archaeological, and textual evidence. The archaeological findings, including coins, pottery, bathhouses, and burial sites, consistently support the idea that Nazareth was a real village during the 1st century. Mythicists who dismiss this evidence are only ignoring the reality of the historical record. The truth is, Nazareth existed, and Jesus likely came from there, an idea that no amount of mythicist denial can change.